Good morning, friends. Today we are going to learn the next part of our introduction to literary criticism, that is, module number 4, literary term symbolism. What is symbolism in literature and how it is a literary term prescribed for you? First of all, we learn what is symbolism. Symbolism was a late 19th century art movement of French, Russian, and Belgian origin in poetry. Basically, it is developed in, originated in poetry, art form of poetry, and other arts seeking to represent absolute truths symbolically through language and metaphorical images, mainly as a reaction against naturalism and realism. Remember, friends, that it is a particularly reaction against the term naturalism and realism. So, read out what are the terms of naturalism and realism. In literature, the style originates with the 1857 publication of Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, the works of Edgar Allan Poe, which Baudelaire admired greatly and translated into French, were a significant influence and the source of many stock tropes and images. The aesthetic was developed by Stephen Mallarmé and Paul Verlaine during the 1860s and 1870s. In the 1880s, the aesthetic was articulated by a series of manifestos and attached a generation of writers. The term symbolist was first applied by the critic Jane Morris, who invented the term to distinguish the symbolist from the related decadents of literature and of art. So, what is the definition of symbolism? That is, symbolism is when an object, person, or place represents an abstract idea beyond its literal meaning. Symbolism in literature can be as obvious as a storm representing a character's internal turmoil, or as subtle as a character's yellow shirt foreshadowing a pending friendship. So, symbolism began as an artistic movement in French poetry in the 19th century to combat realism in favor of romanticism. It comes from the Latin word symbolus, Symbolus, which means a sign of recognition. See some of the examples of symbolism. First example, color. Colors are used as a symbolism. Symbolism exists beyond literature and can be found in everyday life. Certain colors, animals, and objects are known for symbolizing conceptual ideas. Here are some examples. If we see the example of animals, cow is a sacred animal for us. So it is symbolizes there is a 33 crore god and goddesses in the stomach of that cow. So it is a symbolism, it is a sacred one. So first part, colors. Most colors are associated with a feeling or meaning. White symbolizes purity, red is love, green is envy, and yellow is joy and friendship. Red is also known to symbolize stopping, which is equivalent to stop signs and traffic lights. When red and green are placed together, such as on a Wi Fi router, red means something is wrong and green means everything is functioning correctly. Next example we can take of animals. An animal can be symbolic based on its characteristics or its association with a holiday or event. Lions symbolize courage and majesty due to their ranking in the animal kingdom. And black cats symbolize bad luck or spookiness because of their association with Halloween. So, here we can understand how the characters objects, and events are the examples of symbolism. Next is about objects. Everyday objects can represent a myriad of ideas. Balloons are exam, examples of symbolizes celebration, and a rose can represent romance. Symbolism can also depend on context. Pine trees can symbolize nature, but if you add lights and star, it can also represent Christmas. How writers express symbolism. Symbolism in writing is generally expressed in three ways: through the characters, objects, or events of the piece. So, characters, how characters symbolizes. When symbolism is represented in a character, it's shown through their actions and it's usually part of an allegory. In The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, for example, the character Aslan symbolizes Jesus because he sacrifices himself to save Edmund but then come back to life, similar to Jesus dying on the cross and rising again 3 days later. In the Pilgrim's Progress, characters represent different temptations the main character faces on his way to the celestial city, such as the interpreter who explains biblical passages. Next is about events. Sometimes an author uses an occurrences in the plot to act as symbolism. For example, in the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants series, the pants represent the girls' childhood bond. When the pants are lost in the fourth and final book, it symbolizes the loss of their childhood and entrance into adulthood. The event of their disappearance is a symbol independent from the pants themselves. So, next is about in literature. When we see in literature, there is examples of symbolism in literature. Example of Emily Dickinson, Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Dickinson frequently wrote about death, and this poem is no exception. Death is personified in this poem, and several objects help carry out the theme of death. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. In this poem, the carriage itself symbolizes a hearse, as it takes death, immortality, and the speaker of eternal life. The carriage ride symbolizes the time slowly passing before death occurs, and even the dashes at the end of each line signify that the poem is never ending, just like immortality. Next example is about Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter. In the beginning of the novel, Hester Prynne has a scarlet letter pinned to her clothing as a symbol of her adultery. It represents the sin and shame of her act. Next example is of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, the novel where Elizabeth has just been informed that her sister Jane has become ill at the Bingley residence, and she is determined to check in on her no matter the obstacles in getting there. There are types of symbolism. How we learn the particular types of symbolism, that is, figures of speech came under those symbolism in literature also. After the examples, here we are going to learn about the metaphor, simile, allegory, archetype, personification, metonymy, and irony. Symbolism takes on many forms, whether in the literary world or everyday speech. Knowing the differences between various types of symbolism can help you better understand symbolism at its core. Here are some of the various types of symbolism. First is metaphor. A metaphor refers to one thing by directly mentioning another. It essentially compares two dissimilar things while showing that they have something in common. Therefore, while a metaphor can provide clarity, it can also show the similarity between the two things or ideas despite their obvious dissimilarities. Next example is of simile. Rather than implying a comparison like a metaphor, a simile explicitly denotes comparison between two things. Similes often use the word like or as. The two things you compare with a simile are essentially dissimilar. Unlike metaphor, simile are much more direct comparison. Next is about allegory. An allegory refers to a narrative wherein a character, event, or place delivers a large message about a real world concern or occurrence. In other words, it's a story in which most characters and plot developments are symbols for something else, or in which the story in its entirety symbolizes a larger phenomenon in the real world or society. Rather than coming right out and saying it, allegories use characters and events to reveal a hidden meaning or message. An allegory is essentially an extended use of a metaphor and symbolism in general. Next is about archetype. An archetype refers to a story element such as an idea or character type that reoccurs in stories and symbolizes something universal. For example, you can create a character based on certain qualities or traits that make them identifiable to readers. If we can take example of comedies, we can understand how the particular characters from the movies are comedians and they are identifiable to the readers. In the literary world also, archetypes refer to characters, images, or themes that symbolically embody a universal meaning or human experience. Next is about personification. This type of symbolism applies human attributes to something that isn't alive or human. For example, personification gives human form and sensibilities to various objects such as a chair, nature, a book, or an abstract concept like love or hate. Writers use personification to help their readers better relate to non human things or objects. Next is about hyperbole. Hyperbole use an exaggeration to make a specific point or to add emphasis whether for a comic or serious purpose. When used as a figure of speech, you are not meant to take a hyperbole reality literally. Like the opposite of an understatement, hyperboles are often extravagant and often ridiculous overstatements. Not only can a hyperbole catch your attention, but it can also show a contrast between two things. While many authors use hyperboles in works of fiction, many people also use hyperboles in everyday speech. Next is about metonymy. A metonymy substitutes a word with a close association to an entity for the name of the entity itself. In other words, you refer to a thing by the name of something closely associated with it. Writers use metonymy to address something more poetical or uniquely. Metonymy also helps them give a more complex meaning to an otherwise general or ordinary word. Sorry. Next is irony. Irony refers to a figure of speech wherein the intended meaning opposes the literal meaning of the word expressed. There are various types of irony, including dramatic or verbal irony. Irony helps engage readers and adds another layer to a fictional tale. So, here we can understand these are the types of symbolism. Next, what are the characteristics of the symbolism? When we think about learn about the types of symbolism, what are the examples of symbolism, and after that, we must know what are the characteristics of the symbolism. So, when we think about characteristics of symbolism that can be found in literature are that symbols concretize the abstract, have multiple layers of meaning, are allusive, create emotional responses, and are clues about what is important to the author. So, thank you. Here we can understand what is the symbolism, what is the definition of symbolism, what are the characteristics of symbolism, what are the examples of literature, examples in literature of symbolism, and the types of symbolism.